So right now all I have is I've got this HTML page and I've got this script. And what I'm doing in this script is using the fetch API. And I'm using it to grab some data from this endpoint where I could end up getting this data, which was actually generated by a faker library. And what we're going to talk about are third-party libraries. But before we do it, let's talk about why we might have the need for it. By using fetch, which is built into the browser, it's available to us. We don't have to install anything or grab another script file to end up using it. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to use the fetch API to get a response. If I end up going over here and saying response.json, I could then get my result, and I could console.log the result. And if I end up doing that here, I'll see my result, and I've got a count of all these users, but I only get the first 50. That's a nice, happy path, but what if there was an error? So if we end up sending some data here that's not good, it'll take numbers, which are different pages of data, but if I went over here and I put in an X, I get an exception. And yet, this fetch library doesn't really make a distinction. So it thinks that that's successful, and if I went over here and I was going to, console.log, response users, and, result.users, I would end up getting an undefined value, which, again, would not really be considered successful, as opposed to doing this, where I actually have the users. So what we could do with the fetch API is, let's say that we do have a bad request, or there is some error. What I could do is, instead of doing this, I could go over here, and I could instead ask the question. And if I console.log the response, you could find this out by looking at the documentation for the fetch API, I'll see that we've got the idea of a status and whether or not the response is okay. So the fetch API makes me do a little bit of work here, unfortunately. And let me actually put a return over here. Fetch API makes me do a little work, but what I could do is I could say if not response okay, meaning it was not successful, I'm just going to throw the response. And again, this is JSON data, so I really want to get the data from the response. So if I just do this, and I say I'm going to end up throwing the response, now what will end up happening is that I can end up now catching. So it's telling me, hey, look, you had an error, but you didn't end up catching it. And one of the things that you'll often end up doing is catching your exceptions. And I could console.log the exception. And if I look at this, I'll see that what I'm getting here is the error, which is the response. So a couple of things that are a little bit annoying about this is that I just threw the response as an error because it wasn't okay. But if I actually want to get the data from that response, I'm going to have to put this in an async. And I'll go over here and I'll say, my result equals, and I'll need to await on my x.json. And now I could go over here and console log the result, which gives me a little bit of a different error message. So I have an idea of what's going on. This is a little bit of a drag to work with. Let's see how we can end up using a third-party library to make this a little bit easier to do. So instead of using the fetch library, and we could comment this out just maybe so we could compare it a little bit, is I'm going to use the Axios library. And I'm going to tell Axios to get, and I'll use the same URL. So the Axios library has the ability to make these AJAX request calls. Of course, I don't have Axios here, and I'll get this message that Axios doesn't exist. But I can get Axios by typing in Axios CDN. Basically, what I'm looking for is some site that is making this library available to me. It's just a JavaScript file. And there are a lot of sites out there that are available. And now if I click on Axios, I can end up grabbing this library. There's different versions of this library. Some are minified. There's some files here for debugging. But I'm just going to grab this top one, and I'm going to go back to my index.html page, and I'm going to bring this script in. It's important that this is above the other script over here. And I'm going to end up doing that. And at this point, if I go back here, that error is still showing up, but let's actually just see how we can end up dealing with it in a little bit of a easier way with Axios. So Axios, the library, allows us to make these calls, and I could put a then here. One nice thing about the Axios library is that I could just do a console.log response.data. So I don't have to do any awaits for this JSON data, and we could see this with the happy path by going back here, and I could end up seeing my data. So that's one advantage, I think. But what about errors? Here, we could put a catch in, and if we do that, I'll see that I end up getting this response, and I'm seeing it's over here at line 17. And if I actually want to get some more details about it, I could say take the exception and look at the data property. Actually, it's not the data property directly. It's the response.data. So you get the exception, then you can look at the response. And if I do this, again, it's a little bit easier to do the error handling. Instead of having to write this code, which I think is a little bit cumbersome, this API is pretty helpful. It's not that you have to use the Axios API, but it's just a little bit more convenient. And you have to get it from somewhere. And if we're going to use it in our web page, we could end up getting it because someone ended up hosting it over here. We could also get the library and download it and have people access it from our site. But the advantage of a CDN is that these are set up in a way that the user can end up downloading them very quickly. The whole idea with CDNs is that there are proxy servers that are around, that are in a location that take advantage of the fact that there's a proxy server closer to the user. And it's just a little bit easier that you don't have to host it on your own site as well.